Hello again. Thanks for watching the past 4 videos as we've introduced Disciple the Nations and have discussed our goal of making disciples of all nations. Before we end this series of videos, I want to answer one last question. Often, I sense that many churches and Christians that I visit with feel like making disciples of all nations is an impossible task. Most are too afraid to ask it, but it seems like many want to know if we can really reach the world for Christ. It's a good question that we need to think about. How can we accomplish this task? How can we be effective in the short amount of time that we have to give? Well, here are 4 things I believe that we must realize before we try to tackle the Great Commission. Number 1, it's impossible in our own power. When Christ came to Paul on the road to Damascus, Christ called him to an impossible task. Acts 26 records what Christ told him about the plan to take the gospel to the Gentiles. He says, I am sending you to open their eyes so that they may turn from darkness to light and from the power of Satan to God, that they might receive the forgiveness of sins and a place among those who are sanctified by me. Paul had no power to open their eyes. He wasn't such a gifted teacher that they automatically turned away from darkness. He did not have the power to forgive sins. Christ sent Paul to do something that Paul could never do in his own power. Paul was just as helpless as you and I are to save someone else. We can't do that. That would be impossible. Why? Because salvation is of the Lord. Only He can save. But He has chosen to use His people as His messengers, and He has promised to work through us. In the verse preceding the Great Commission, Christ encourages us by saying that all authority in heaven and earth has been given to Him. And because He has all power and authority, He says, therefore, go. He calls us to work for His mission, and He supplies us with His power. It is completely impossible in our own power. Number 2, it's impossible with our own methods. Missions history is sometimes interesting. Many times people with good motives have tried to reach the world, but good motives by themselves are not enough. God has not only promised that His kingdom would advance, but that it would advance on His terms, through His chosen means. We must obey the great commandment by loving God and loving our neighbor. We must seek to make disciples through faithful teaching of God's Word, and we must equip others to do the same. Through evangelism and discipleship, God faithfully works through multiplication. He never intended for us to reach the world by ourselves. He wants us to reach others, train and disciple them, then send them out to reach others too. 2 Timothy 2:2, Titus chapter 1, the entire book of Acts talks about how God multiplies workers through the faithful, patient ministry of His people. When God's people trust God's methods, God works. And suddenly the mission field, those we go to reach, become the mission force, and the ripple effect of God's method reaches the nations. Number 3, it's impossible if we disconnect from God's church. Missions by God's design is from, by, and to a church. Missionaries are sent from a church, served and shepherded by the church, and should be sent to either plant, strengthen, or extend the reach of another local church. Often, the church has been benched by others who claim they are better at missions than them. But the Great Commission is obviously for churches. We cannot disconnect from the church. That's why Disciple the Nations works to enlist, encourage, and equip God's churches for God's global purpose. And lastly, it's impossible if we work for our own glory and renown. Christian mission is not about writing your own story, but about recognizing and living out your role in God's story. Jesus said that unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. To make disciples, a faithful Christian has to take up their cross, die to themselves, and follow Christ. It's a foundational requirement. God has always used men and women who are willing to leave goods and kindred behind, and for the sake of Christ, board a ship or a plane headed to the nations. There was a story about a young Moravian missionary who had sold himself into slavery so that he could take the gospel to an island of slaves. Knowing he would never return to his homeland, he shouted to his family from the deck of the ship, "May the Lamb that was slain receive the reward for His suffering." Christ is worthy, and we seek to glorify His name. The task of the Great Commission often looks impossible. But the biblical call to missions isn't based on the hope of our power, our methods, our authority, or our fame. If it was, it would fail and missionaries should just stay home. However, since we trust in God's power, God's methods, God's church, and we work for God's glory, it's more than possible. This is the way God has chosen to reach the world. We know from reading the end of the story how God is working through missions to redeem a people from every tribe, tongue, and nation. Missions is how God has promised to accomplish His plan. So, we work with trembling expectation. We believe people will be turned from darkness unto light, and from the power of Satan unto God, and that they will receive forgiveness of sins. Why? Not because of us, but because of the promise of God. The Great Commission is a daunting task, but not for the King of the universe. So let's get to work. Soli Deo Gloria.